Thomas Anderson never expected much from life anymore. At 68, he lived alone in his old mobile home, getting by on Social Security and whatever odd jobs his neighbors could spare. His daily routine was simple: wake up, make coffee, feed the stray cat that visited his porch, and try to keep warm during the harsh New Hampshire winter. But on that freezing December morning, as he walked past Lake Winnipesaukee, he heard the screams. Two small figures thrashing in the icy water. Without thinking, he ran toward them. The next morning, Thomas woke up in a mansion, surrounded by luxury he'd never known. But how did he get there? And why did the wealthy family living there treat him like he'd always belonged? Thomas's worn leather wallet lay open on his small kitchen table, the morning light catching the scratches that marked its decades of use. Inside, behind expired coupons and carefully folded dollar bills, a faded photograph showed a woman with kind eyes and an infectious smile. Martha. Even after 15 years, he still talked to her every morning. "Another day, old girl," he murmured, running his finger along the photo's worn edge. Another day. The mobile home creaked as he moved about his morning routine, its familiar sounds a symphony he knew by heart. The coffee maker, ancient but reliable, sputtered to life. His daily planner, coffee-stained and dog-eared, sat next to a stack of bills marked urgent in red ink. Thomas picked up his pen, carefully noting today's odd jobs in shaky handwriting. Mrs. Peterson's gutters, $30. Mr. Rodriguez's fence repair, $45. Not much, but every dollar counted when the Social Security check barely covered the lot rent. And utilities. A soft meow drew his attention to the door. Oscar, the neighborhood stray, sat expectantly on the wooden step outside. The orange tabby had started visiting 6 months ago, and Thomas found himself setting aside a portion of his own meals to ensure the cat never went hungry. "Morning, friend," Thomas said, opening the door. The December air bit at his face as he placed a small bowl of kibble on the porch. "At least one of us is eating well today." He watched Oscar eat, remembering how Martha had always wanted a cat. "Too much responsibility," he'd said back then. Always focused on work, on providing, on the future. Now, the future had arrived, and it was emptier than he'd imagined. His neighbor, Grace Wilson, waved from her porch next door. At 73, she still delivered meals to homebound seniors through her church group. Sometimes she'd bring Thomas leftovers, though they both pretended it was because she'd made too much. "Cold one today, Thomas," she called out. "Don't forget your scarf when you head out." He nodded, grateful for her concern. Grace was one of the few who still treated him like a person, not a charity case. When his truck had broken down last month, she'd driven him to his odd jobs for 2 weeks straight, refusing any payment. Back inside, Thomas pulled out his medication organizer. The arthritis pills were running low, but the refill would have to wait until next month's check. His hands weren't as bad as his pride, anyway. The latter ached more with each job he took, each favor he accepted, each pitying look from people who remembered when he'd owned the hardware store in town. The store. He tried not to think about it anymore. 27 years of building a business, of knowing every customer by name, of helping young couples pick out their first tool sets and watching their children grow up to do the same. Then the big box store had opened on the highway, and within 2 years he'd been forced to sell. Martha's cancer had taken care of what little they'd managed to save from the sale. Thomas finished his coffee and pulled on his warmest coat, a Goodwill find from 3 winters ago. The weather report predicted record low temperatures, but Mr. Rodriguez's fence wouldn't fix itself. Besides, movement kept the cold at bay, both outside and in. He picked up his toolbox, its handle smooth from years of use. Martha's voice echoed. In his memory, "You've got magic in those hands, Tom. You can fix anything. Not everything, as it turned out. Not her, not their dreams, not the lonely silence that filled his home each evening. But he could fix a fence. He could clean gutters. He could wake up each morning and face the day with the dignity Martha had always admired in him. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough." Thomas stepped outside, locking his door out of habit rather than necessity. There wasn't much worth taking. Oscar had finished his breakfast and disappeared, probably to one of his other benefactors in the neighborhood. The morning sun offered little warmth as Thomas began his daily walk toward town, his toolbox heavy in one hand and his old planner tucked safely in his coat pocket. He took his usual route past Lake Winnipesaukee, its surface beginning to freeze. In the winter chill, the lake had always been Martha's favorite place. "It's like a mirror for the sky," she used to say. Today, it reflected only grey clouds and the promise of snow. Consciousness returned to Thomas slowly, like waves lapping at a distant shore. The first thing he noticed was the softness surrounding him, a weightless, cloud-like embrace, unlike anything he'd felt before. His eyes remained closed as his mind struggled to piece together fragments of memory, screaming, ice-cold water, the weight of small bodies in his arms, then darkness. When he finally opened his eyes, he blinked several times, certain he was dreaming. Gone was his cramped bedroom with its water-stained ceiling. Instead, he lay in an enormous four-poster bed, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked manicured gardens dusted with snow. An ornate pocket watch ticked quietly on the bedside table, its golden surface catching the morning light. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson," a gentle voice said. Thomas startled, turning to find a woman in a crisp uniform standing by the door. Her grey hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her smile warm but professional. "I'm Mrs. Sullivan, the head housekeeper. How are you feeling?" Where am I?" Thomas's voice was rough, his throat sore. "You're at Harrison Estate. After your heroic actions yesterday, Mr. Harrison insisted you receive the best care." She approached, carrying a silver tray. "The doctor said you'll be just fine, but you need rest and warmth. Tea." Thomas nodded automatically, still trying to process her words. Harrison Estate. The name stirred something in his memory. Headlines about a reclusive tech billionaire who'd bought the old Maxwell property on the lake's north shore. Mrs. Sullivan poured tea into a delicate china cup. "The children have been asking about you since dawn. They're quite eager to thank their rescuer." The children. Images flashed through Thomas's mind. Two small figures thrashing in the freezing water, their matching red winter coats bright against the grey lake. He'd been walking to Mr. Rodriguez's house when he heard the screams. After that, everything was a blur of adrenaline and instinct. "Are they?" he began. "They're perfectly fine, thanks to you." Mrs. Sullivan's eyes softened. "Emma and Ethan, the twins. They've never been very good at following rules about ice safety, I'm afraid." Thomas sipped the tea, its warmth spreading through his chest. His clothes, his old patched clothes, had been replaced with silk pajamas that felt foreign against his skin. The pocket watch on the bedside table caught his eye again. He reached for it, noting an inscription on its surface. "To those who act without hesitation, time gives its greatest gifts." A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Two identical faces peered around the doorframe, their green eyes wide with excitement. "Is he awake?" a small voice whispered loudly. Mrs. Sullivan sighed, but her expression was fond. "Come in then, but remember what we discussed about indoor voices." The twins entered, holding hands, their matching faces bearing the same mix of shyness and eagerness. The girl, Emma, Thomas presumed, spoke first. "Thank you for saving us, Mr. Anderson," she said formally, clearly rehearsed. Then her composure broke, and she rushed forward to hug him, her brother following suit. Thomas found himself enveloped in the warmth of their embrace, their small arms tight around him. Something deep in his chest, something that had been frozen for 15 years, began to thaw. "Daddy wanted to be here," Ethan said, pulling back, "but he had an emergency in Tokyo. He'll be back soon, though." "He said you're going to stay with us forever," Emma added, bouncing slightly on the bed. "In the blue suite. Mrs. Sullivan already has people bringing your things." Thomas looked questioningly at the housekeeper, who smiled apologetically. "Mr. Harrison left specific instructions. He'd like you to consider staying, at least until he returns to discuss matters properly." We've taken the liberty of collecting your belongings from your home, with proper compensation to your landlord, of course. But my cat, Thomas began. Oscar has already been installed in the kitchen with his own bed and dishes. Mrs. Sullivan assured him. He's quite taken with our chef. Thomas sat back against the pillows, overwhelmed. The twins chattered excitedly about showing him the house, their words tumbling over each other. The pocket watch ticked steadily beside him, marking the seconds of his old life falling away, and something new, something impossible, taking shape. Through the windows, he could see Lake Winnipesaukee in the distance, its surface glittering. In the morning sun, somewhere he thought he could hear Martha laughing with delight at this turn of events. She'd always told him that life had a way of surprising you just when you thought all the surprises were over. After breakfast in bed, a feast that made Thomas's usual coffee and toast seem like a distant memory, the twins insisted on giving him a tour. Mrs. Sullivan provided a wheelchair, despite his protests that he could walk. "Doctor's orders," she said firmly. "At least for today." Emma and Ethan took turns pushing the chair, their enthusiasm occasionally sending him rolling faster than Mrs. Sullivan deemed appropriate. In each twin's free hand, they clutched identical teddy bears, Emma's with a blue ribbon, Ethan's with a red one. "These are Bernard and Winston," Emma explained, holding up her bear. "Mommy gave them to us before she went to heaven." The casual mention of their mother made Thomas's heart twist. He recognized that tone, the same matter-of-fact way he sometimes spoke about Martha, as if stating a simple truth could make the loss easier to bear. "They go everywhere with us," Ethan added. "Even to the lake." His voice dropped. "We're not supposed to talk about the lake." "But we want to," Emma insisted, stopping the wheelchair by a window overlooking the grounds. "Mrs. Sullivan says we need to process our feelings." Thomas noticed how the twins' hands tightened on their bears. Ethan spoke first, his words tumbling. "Out in a rush. We were playing Explorer. The lake looked solid, and we'd seen people skating last week. Emma said we should wait for Daddy to come home, but I said explorers don't wait." "It's my fault too," Emma interjected. "I followed him. We always follow each other." "The ice," Ethan's voice wavered. "It wasn't like in movies, no big cracking sound. Just suddenly we were in the water and it was so cold we couldn't breathe." Emma hugged her bear closer. "We tried to remember what Daddy taught us about ice safety, but our clothes were so heavy. Then we saw you running toward us. You didn't even hesitate," Ethan said, his eyes wide with admiration. "Like a superhero." Thomas shook his head. "Not a superhero, just someone who heard you needed help." "But you jumped right in," Emma protested. "And you kept telling us to stay calm, even though you must have been freezing too. You held us up and kicked the ice until it broke toward the shore. The rescue team said we would have—" Ethan stopped, looking at his feet. Mrs. Sullivan, who had been quietly following them, stepped forward. "Perhaps that's enough excitement for now. Mr. Anderson needs his rest." But Thomas reached out, taking each twin's hand in his. Their small fingers were warm now, so different from the icy grip he remembered from yesterday. "When I was your age," he said softly, "I had a twin sister too." Both children's eyes widened. "You did?" "Sarah, we were inseparable, just like—" "You too. One winter, we did something very similar, but there wasn't anyone nearby to help. Sarah." He paused, surprised by how fresh the pain still felt after 60 years. "I lost her that day." Emma and Ethan moved closer, their bears pressed against his arms. "Is that why you saved us?" Emma whispered. "Maybe, but mostly because that's what people should do for each other. Help when they can." "Daddy says the same thing." Ethan nodded sagely. "He says having money means nothing if you don't use it to help people. That's why he builds hospitals and schools. And that's why you're staying with us," Emma added, with the absolute certainty of an 8-year-old. "Because you helped us, so now we help you." Thomas felt tears prickling at his eyes. He looked at Mrs. Sullivan, who was discreetly wiping her own eyes with a handkerchief. "Your father seems like a wise man," he said, The wisest, the twins agreed in unison. And the busiest, Ethan added with a slight frown, but he promised to come home soon this time. He always keeps his promises. Mrs. Sullivan checked her. Watch. Speaking of promises, you two have a math lesson with Miss Chen in 5 minutes. The twins groaned, but obediently hugged Thomas goodbye, their bears softly bumping his shoulders. As they ran down the hallway, their footsteps echoing off marble floors, Thomas watched them go with a mixture of wonder and gratitude. These children, with their matching bears and boundless hearts, had given him something he thought he'd lost forever, a reason to look forward to tomorrow. By evening, Thomas had been moved to what the staff called his suite, a space larger than his entire mobile home. A handwritten welcome note sat propped on the mahogany desk, signed by each staff member with personal messages of gratitude. Mrs. Sullivan had placed it there along with a tablet she called Your House Control Center. Just tap the screen to adjust lights, temperature, or call for assistance, she explained, demonstrating with practiced patience. Thomas stared at the device as if it might bite. In my day, we just use switches. The switches still work, she assured him, kindly demonstrating the old-fashioned light controls. Mr. Harrison believes in backup systems. That first night was the strangest of Thomas's life. The bed, while impossibly comfortable, felt too large, too soft. The silence was different too. No creaking walls, no rattling heater, no familiar sounds of neighboring trailers. Instead, there was just the gentle hum of perfect climate control and the distant ticking of that mysterious pocket watch. He woke at dawn out of habit, momentarily panicked by the unfamiliar surroundings. His work clothes had been replaced with an entire wardrobe of tailored items, each piece fitting perfectly. A note explained that his old clothes were being cleaned and mended, as per Mr. Harrison's instructions. Breakfast proved to be another adventure. The chef, a cheerful man named Miguel, seemed determined to make up for years of Thomas's simple meals all at once. The spread was overwhelming: fresh fruits, eggs prepared 3 ways, homemade breads, and something called artisanal coffee. Oscar approved the salmon, Miguel announced proudly, gesturing to where the orange cat sat contentedly in a custom bed near the kitchen's warmth. He has excellent taste. Thomas found himself chuckling at the sight of his former stray now, living like royalty. Seems we've both moved up in the world, old friend. The twins joined him for breakfast, bringing a welcome sense of normalcy with their childish squabbles over the last croissant and debates about whether chocolate milk counted as milk for breakfast purposes. Did you figure out your room's computer yet? Ethan asked around a mouthful of toast. Ethan, manners, Mrs. Sullivan reminded from her post near the door. Sorry, he mumbled, swallowing. We can help you learn it. It's super easy. Thomas thought of the tablet sitting untouched on his desk. Maybe later. I'm still getting used to having a television that appears from the ceiling. That's nothing, Emma said excitedly. Wait till you see the movie theater downstairs. And the indoor pool. Can you teach us to swim better? Mrs. Sullivan said you were on your high school swim team. Thomas blinked, surprised by this detail from his past. The staff's background research had clearly been thorough. The day unfolded in a series of similar discoveries and adjustments. Each hour brought some new wonder or challenge. A shower with more settings than his old truck had parts, a closet that could fit his entire former living room, and a security system that required fingerprint scans. But it was the small kindnesses that overwhelmed him most. The way his favorite reading chair from home had been carefully placed by his new fireplace. How someone had arranged his few photographs in beautiful frames. The container of his preferred coffee brand, the cheap kind, sitting beside the expensive beans in the kitchen. Late afternoon found him in the library, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the lake. The twins were at their lessons, and a peaceful quiet had settled over the mansion. Thomas ran his fingers along the spines of leather-bound books, remembering how Martha had always dreamed of having a proper library. She would have loved this, he whispered to himself. Mr. Anderson? Mrs. Sullivan's voice was gentle. The children were hoping you might join them for their evening swim lesson. Only if you're feeling up to it, of course. Thomas turned from the window, surprised to find tears in his eyes. Mrs. Sullivan pretended not to notice, her discretion yet another kindness. I think, he said slowly, I would like that very much. As he followed her to the pool area, Thomas realized that for the first time in years he was looking forward to what the evening might bring. The luxury surrounding him still felt foreign, but the warmth of belonging that was beginning to feel like home. After the swimming lesson, where Thomas discovered the twins had inherited his natural affinity for water, Mrs. Sullivan appeared with a sleek video tablet. Her expression was more serious than usual. Mr. Harrison would like to speak with you, she said, placing the device on the library desk. Take all the time you need. We'll ensure you're not disturbed. The screen flickered to life, revealing a man in his early 40s with kind eyes and premature grey at his temples. Despite wearing what was clearly an expensive suit, William Harrison had an approachable presence that reminded Thomas of his own father. Mr. Anderson, Harrison began, his voice warm. First, let me thank you for saving my children. Those words feel inadequate given what you risked, but they come from the depths of my heart. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Anyone would have done the same, but they didn't. You did. Harrison leaned closer to the camera. I've watched the security footage. 12 people walked past that section of the lake that morning. Only you acted without hesitation. A pause, heavy, with meaning. I apologize for not being there in person. A critical situation in Tokyo demanded my immediate attention. But I've been watching the house feeds, seeing how you interact with Emma and Ethan. They've smiled more in the past day than they have in months. Harrison's expression softened. After their mother died 3 years ago, something in them dimmed. I tried everything. Therapy, trips, activities. But between managing the company and my own grief, I fear I've failed them in many ways. He ran a hand through his hair, a startlingly human gesture for a man worth billions. What they need isn't more things or opportunities. They need someone who understands loss, who can show them how to move forward with grace. Someone like you. Thomas felt his throat tighten. Mr. Harrison, I'm just a broken-down old man who owned a successful business for 27 years, who nursed his wife through a terminal illness without ever taking a day off, who's performed free repairs for elderly neighbors despite barely making ends meet himself. Harrison smiled. Did you think we wouldn't do our research? The tablet showed a series of documents. Thomas's business records, charitable donations, from leaner years, letters of gratitude from community members. I'm not offering charity, Mr. Anderson. I'm offering a position, a purpose. The twins need a grandfather figure, someone who can be there when I can't. The salary is generous with full medical coverage and a pension plan. The suite is yours regardless of your decision. Harrison's eyes grew distant. My own grandfather raised me after my parents died. He taught me everything that mattered: integrity, compassion, the value of hard work. I see those same qualities in you. Thomas sat in silence, processing the magnitude of what was being offered. Take time to think about it, Harrison continued. I'll be home in 3 days. But know this, you saved more than my children's lives that day. You gave them back their joy. How do you repay something like that? The screen went dark, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts and the steady ticking of the pocket watch. Through the library window, he could see the twins playing in the garden with their bears, their laughter carrying faintly through the glass. Mrs. Sullivan appeared silently at his elbow with a cup of tea. His favorite kind, he noted absently. He's a good man, she said quietly, but a man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing isn't truly wealthy. Mr. Harrison understands both. Thomas watched the twins chase each other through carefully manicured hedges, their matching winter coats bright against the snow. Something Martha used to say echoed in his mind. Life's greatest gifts often come disguised as its greatest challenges. He picked up his tea, hiding a smile as he watched Oscar slink through the garden below, now wearing what appeared to be a custom-made collar. "Well," he said softly, "I suppose even old dogs can learn new tricks." That evening, Thomas found himself unable to sleep, his mind racing with memories and doubts. During his nightly room tidying, he'd discovered an old newspaper clipping tucked into one of his rescued photo albums. The headline stared up at him, in faded ink. "Local business owner's wife loses battle with cancer." The article was brief, clinical in its details, but holding it transported Thomas back to that sterile hospital room, to Martha's final words. "Promise me you'll find joy again. Tom, promise me you won't shut yourself away." He hadn't kept that promise, not really. Instead, he'd constructed a life of careful routines and minimal expectations, protecting himself from both hope and disappointment. Now, pacing his luxurious suite in monogrammed slippers that probably cost more than his monthly Social Security check, Thomas felt like an imposter. The morning paper, delivered on silver tray, no less, had featured a small article about his rescue of the twins. "Local hero," they called him. But heroes didn't wake up at 3 a.m. wondering if they deserved their good fortune. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Anderson?" Mrs. Sullivan's voice was gentle. "I saw your light. Would you like some warm milk?" He opened the door to find her holding not just milk, but a plate of cookies. Her grey hair was in a loose braid, the first time he'd seen her looking less than perfectly polished. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. "I never do when Mr. Harrison's away," she admitted, setting down her offerings. "The house feels unsettled." Thomas understood. Despite its grandeur, or perhaps because of it, the mansion held an air of expectancy, like an instrument waiting to be played. "The twins," he began hesitantly. "They seem so attached already. What if I disappoint them?" Mrs. Sullivan's expression softened. "You know, when their mother died, Miss Emma didn't speak for 2 months. Master Ethan developed terrible nightmares. But yesterday, I heard them laughing, really laughing, for the first time in years." She straightened a photo frame on his desk, one showing Martha in her garden. "Love isn't about deserving, Mr. Anderson. It's about being present, being real." "I'm not exactly qualified to help raise billionaires' children," Thomas muttered. "No?" She raised an eyebrow. "Tell me, what did you do when you found out about Martha's diagnosis?" Thomas blinked at the sudden question. I sold the store, used everything we had for her treatment, and after she passed, kept going. What else could I do?" "Exactly." Mrs. Sullivan's voice was firm. "Those children don't need someone to teach them about wealth. They need someone to show them how to keep going, how to face loss with grace, how to value what matters." A distant cry interrupted them, Ethan's voice high with fear. Without thinking, Thomas was moving, his body remembering countless nights of comforting his own children decades ago. He found both twins in Ethan's room, Emma already trying to soothe her brother. Their teddy bears were clutched tight. "The ice," Ethan whimpered. "In my dream, no one came." Thomas sat on the beds, edge gathering both children close. "But someone did come, and someone always will. Promise?" Emma's voice was small. "Promise." The word felt different this time, not a burden, but a bridge. Mrs. Sullivan watched from the doorway as Thomas began telling them about his own childhood adventures with his twin, Sarah. Happy stories, funny stories, memories he hadn't visited in years. Gradually, the tension left their small bodies, their breathing deepened. Looking down at their sleeping faces, Thomas realized something. The local paper had it wrong. He wasn't a hero for jumping into that lake. The real courage would be in what came next, opening his heart again, risking love and loss, keeping promises not just to Martha, but to himself. "They'll sleep now," he whispered to Mrs. Sullivan as he carefully tucked the twins in. She nodded, her eyes knowing. "And you?" Thomas glanced at the pocket watch on Ethan's bedside table, its steady ticking a reminder that time moved only forward. "I think," he said slowly. I'm finally ready to wake up. The next evening brought new challenges. A formal family dinner had been arranged to welcome Thomas, though William Harrison was still in Tokyo. Mrs. Sullivan spent the morning coaching him on the intricacies of multiple forks and proper wine. Glass placement, though her eyes twinkled when he muttered about how a single spoon had served him just fine for 68 years. A newly delivered family portrait dominated the dining room's far wall, its gilded frame gleaming in the chandelier light. Thomas couldn't help but notice the careful composition. William Harrison standing behind his children, the space beside, him conspicuously empty where their mother should have been. "Aunt Victoria's coming," Emma announced at breakfast, her tone suggesting this wasn't entirely good news. "With Cousin Bradley," Ethan added, making a face. Mrs. Sullivan's usual calm showed a slight crack. "Children, remember your manners. Family is family." By 6 o'clock, Thomas had changed clothes 3 times, finally settling on a navy suit that felt like it cost more than his old car. The twins had been scrubbed and polished until they practically sparkled, though Ethan's cowlick stubbornly refused to stay down. Victoria Harrison's arrival was heralded by the purr of an expensive engine and the click of designer heels on marble. She swept into the foyer like a perfectly coiffed storm, her teenage son trailing behind her with the bored expression unique to 15-year-olds. "Emma, darling, you're getting tall," Victoria air-kissed her niece. "Ethan, do stand up straight." Her gaze found Thomas sharpening. "And this must be our hero." The way she said hero made it sound like a questionable life choice. "Thomas Anderson, ma'am," he offered his hand. "Thank you for coming." "Yes, well, family obligations." She handed her coat to the waiting butler. "Though I must say, William's impulsiveness continues to astound me, taking in complete strangers." "He saved us, Aunt Victoria," Ethan protested. "He's not a stranger." "Sweet boy, adults are talking." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "I assume background checks were at least performed?" "Most thoroughly, madam," Mrs. Sullivan interjected smoothly. "Dinner is served." The dining room gleamed with silver and crystal. Thomas found himself seated between the twins, across from Victoria. Bradley slumped in his chair, phone hidden in his lap. "Bradley, device away," Victoria snapped. "Do tell. Ask Mr. Anderson what made you decide to relocate so quickly. Your previous living situation must have been quite basic." Thomas felt Emma's small hand slip into his under the table. "Actually, I haven't decided anything yet. Your brother's offer was very generous, but—" "Oh, so there's an offer involved." Victoria's eyebrows rose. "How fascinating." "Aunt Victoria," Emma said suddenly, "did you know Mr. Anderson owned the biggest hardware store in town? He taught us about different kinds of wood yesterday, and he knows everything about fixing things." "Yeah," Ethan chimed in. "He's helping me build a birdhouse. A proper one, not like the crooked one Bradley made last summer." "That was 3 years ago, twerp," Bradley muttered. "Children," Mrs. Sullivan warned quietly. Victoria sipped her wine. "How quaint, though I'm not sure handyman skills qualify one for childcare. William's becoming entirely too trusting since Claire's passing." The twins stiffened at their mother's name. Thomas felt their grip tighten. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "in my experience, trust isn't given. It's earned. Every day, in small ways." He smiled at the twins, "like building birdhouses, or making hot chocolate," Emma added. "Or telling the best bedtime stories," Ethan nodded. Victoria's lips thinned. "Yes, well, stories won't prepare them for board meetings and society functions. Claire understood that, at least." "Mother," Bradley looked up from his phone, surprising everyone. "Can you just not, for once?" The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle clink of silverware. Thomas noticed Mrs. Sullivan hiding a smile behind her napkin. Later, after Victoria had departed in a cloud of expensive perfume and thinly veiled threats to speak to William, Thomas found himself back in the library with the twins. They'd dragged in pillows and blankets, making a fort under his reading desk. Did we do okay? Ethan asked anxiously. With telling Aunt Victoria about you? Thomas thought. About the evening, the barbs, the implications, the quiet strength of children defending what they believed in. You did perfectly, he assured them. Sometimes the best way to handle difficult people is to simply be genuine. Like you were, Emma said proudly. Daddy says that too, that real things matter more than fancy things. Thomas glanced at the family portrait, at that empty space waiting to be filled. Not with a replacement, he realized, but with something new, something real. Your father, he said softly, sounds wiser every day. The next morning, Thomas found himself exploring the mansion's vast library, searching for a book the twins had requested for bedtime. His fingers trailed along leather spines until a loose paper fluttered to the floor. An old letter, its edges worn soft with time. The handwriting was elegant but tired, dated 3 years ago. My dearest William, if you're reading this, then I've lost my battle with cancer. There's so much I want to tell you, but time grows short. The twins will need guidance, not just in business or society, but in resilience, in finding joy after loss. Remember Thomas Anderson, the hardware store owner who helped your father when we first moved here? Who gave you your first job, stocking shelves at 14? I've watched him these past years, seeing how he's handled his own losses with such quiet dignity. People like that, they're rare. They understand what matters. Keep your eyes open, my love. Sometimes the answers we seek are closer than we think. All my love, Claire. Thomas sat heavily in the nearest chair, memories flooding back. The gangly teenager who'd worked summers at his store, eager to learn everything about tools and trades. He'd lost track of the boy after the store closed, never connecting him to the tech billionaire who'd bought the Maxwell estate. I see you. Found it. Mrs. Sullivan's voice was gentle. She carried a tea tray with 2 cups. I wondered when you would. You knew? Claire left several letters. This one, she asked me to make sure it ended up in the right hands at the right time. She poured the tea. Mr. Harrison doesn't know about it yet. Claire understood him, knew he'd need to find his own way to the right decision. The accident at the lake was genuine, but perhaps not entirely coincidental. The twins have always been drawn to that spot, despite our best efforts. Claire used to say some forces in the universe were bigger than our plans. Thomas thought of William's careful background check, his immediate trust, the ready acceptance. How long have you been watching me? Claire kept track of you after the store closed. She never forgot how you helped her family when they first arrived, newcomers in a small town, a father trying to rebuild after bankruptcy. Mrs. Sullivan smiled. She said you never made them feel like charity cases, even when you knew they couldn't afford the better tools. A memory surfaced, a proud man with 2 young children, buying supplies to repair their modest rental home. Thomas had thrown in extra materials left over from another job, knowing they were needed but couldn't be afforded. William was such a serious child, Thomas mused, always asking questions about how things worked. He still is. Serious, curious, always trying to fix things. She glanced at the letter. But some things can't be fixed with money or technology. Some things need different tools. The sound of running feet interrupted them. The twins burst in, cheeks flushed from playing outside. Mr. Anderson, look what we found in the garden. Emma held up a worn wooden toolbox, its surface scratched but solid. Daddy's old one, from when he worked at your store. Ethan was already opening it, revealing carefully maintained tools. Can you teach us how to use them? Like you taught? Daddy? Thomas picked up a hammer, its handle smooth from years of use. He remembered placing it in young William's hands, showing him the proper grip, the careful balance. Your father was a quick learner, he said softly. Always wanted to understand the foundations, not just the surface. That's what he says. About business too. Emma nodded seriously. About building things that last. Mrs. Sullivan gathered the letter quietly, tucking it away. But Thomas caught her whispered words as she left. Some foundations are built with hammer and nails, others with something stronger. Looking at the twins examining their father's old tools, Thomas felt pieces clicking into place. Not just the past and present, but perhaps the future too. Claire's letter hadn't just revealed a connection, it had shown a path forward. "Well then," he said, picking up the toolbox, "let's start with the basics. First rule of building anything: measure twice, cut once." The twins leaned in eagerly as he began to explain, their eyes bright with the same curiosity he remembered in their father's. Outside the library windows, the lake sparkled in the morning sun, its surface smooth and full of possibility. The weather turned that evening, bringing a fierce winter storm that rattled the mansion's windows. Thomas sat with the twins in their makeshift library fort, the power having gone out an hour earlier. Battery-operated lanterns cast warm circles. Of light as wind howled outside. "Tell us another story about Daddy as a teenager," Emma requested, adding to the growing pile of drawings beside her. The latest showed 5 figures: the twins, their father, Thomas, and Mrs. Sullivan, all holding hands in front of the mansion. "Well," Thomas began, adjusting the lantern, "there was the time he decided to reorganize the entire hardware store's inventory system." A particularly loud thundercrack interrupted him. Ethan jumped, clutching his bear tighter. "The storm can't get us in here," Thomas assured him. "This house has stood for over a century. But what if the power stays out?" Emma worried. "The freezer in the kitchen, Chef Miguel's special ice cream." Thomas chuckled. "Actually, your father helped me install a backup generator once, said every good system needs redundancy." "What's redundancy?" Ethan asked. "It means having a backup plan. Speaking of which," Thomas reached for his old toolbox. "Why don't we build something useful while we wait?" Using materials from the box and supplies the twins gathered from around the library, they constructed simple hand-cranked flashlights. Thomas guided their small hands, teaching them about circuits and connections. "See, when you turn the handle, it creates energy. No batteries needed." "Like magic!" Emma exclaimed, delighted by the beam of light she'd created. "Better than magic," Thomas corrected. "This is science and craftsmanship, things you can understand and rely on." Mrs. Sullivan appeared with hot chocolate and news. "The main power lines are down across the county, could be out till morning." "Can we sleep in the fort?" the twins asked in unison. "Please," Emma added. "Mr. Anderson can tell us more stories about Daddy." Mrs. Sullivan hesitated, then nodded. "I'll get some proper blankets, and perhaps," she smiled, "I have some stories of my own about your father and your mother." The evening turned magical. Mrs. Sullivan shared tales of Claire's first attempts at cooking. The smoke alarms got quite a workout, while Thomas recalled William's determination to master every tool in the store, even the ones we didn't sell. Between stories, they played shadow puppets with their handmade lights. The twins created elaborate scenarios, their fears of the storm forgotten in the warmth of shared memories and new discoveries. "Mom used to do this too," Ethan said suddenly, making his bear dance in the flashlight beam. "During storms. She said shadows couldn't hurt you if you made them dance." Emma added her bear to the performance. She was right. Nothing bad feels quite as bad when you're not alone. Thomas caught Mrs. Sullivan wiping her eyes in the dimness. He understood. These moments of healing often came with their own kind of ache, sweet and necessary. Later, as the twins finally drifted off to sleep, their new flashlights clutched close, Mrs. Sullivan gathered their drawings. "They haven't drawn their mother in their pictures for 2 years, she whispered. "Too painful," the therapist said. "But look." She held up Emma's latest artwork. There, floating above the 5 figures like a gentle star, was a 6th, a woman with Claire's smile, watching over them all. "Sometimes," Thomas said softly, adjusting a blanket over the sleeping children, "the light we need most is the kind we create ourselves." Outside, the storm began to ease, but inside the library fort, something stronger than any weather had taken root. The foundation of a new kind of family, built with tools more lasting than hammer and nails. Trust memory, and love. Mrs. Sullivan gathered her teacup. I should check on the rest of the staff. Will you be all right here? Thomas looked at the twins, peaceful in sleep, their handmade lights still glowing softly. I think we all will be. Victoria Harrison's next move came in the form of legal documents, delivered by courier the following morning. The thick envelope landed on Thomas's desk like a declaration of war, its contents laying bare her intentions. A draft of adoption papers for the twins, with her name prominently displayed. She can't do this. Mrs. Sullivan's usually calm voice shook as she read over his shoulder. Mr. Harrison would never allow it. But he's not here, Thomas said quietly. And as their aunt, she has no legal standing while their father lives. A new voice interrupted. James Chen, the Harrison family's longtime lawyer, stood in the doorway. William called me this morning. May I? He picked up the papers, scanning them with practiced eyes. Ah, Victoria. Always ambitious, never quite clever enough. He set them down with a slight smile. These aren't worth the paper they're printed on. But why now? Thomas asked. Because William informed the board yesterday that he's restructuring the company, spending more time at home, fewer international trips. James straightened his tie. Victoria's position as acting CEO during his absences would be diminished. A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. The twins burst in, still in their pajamas despite Mrs. Sullivan's usual insistence on proper dress for breakfast. Is it true? Emma demanded. Bradley texted us. Aunt Victoria says we're going to live with her. She says Mr. Anderson has to leave, Ethan added, his voice breaking. Thomas knelt to their level, his heart aching at their distress. No one's going anywhere. Your father has made sure of that. But she's family, Emma whispered. Why doesn't she want us to be happy? James and Mrs. Sullivan exchanged glances. Perhaps, the lawyer suggested gently, this is a conversation best had over breakfast. I believe I smell Miguel's famous waffles. In the kitchen, over plates piled with comfort food, James explained the situation in terms the children could understand. Victoria's power play, their father's countermoves, the legal realities that protected them. Your father, he concluded, has also filed his own papers. He pulled out another document, this one bearing William's signature, a guardianship agreement, naming Mr. Anderson as your official grandfather. The twins' eyes widened. Thomas felt his own breath catch. It just needs your signature, James told him, if you're willing. Before Thomas could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from Grace, his former neighbor. Victoria Harrison just tried to interview me about you. I told her about how you fixed my roof for free last winter, and about Martha's medical bills, and about the Christmas presents you always got for the Thompson kids when their father lost his job. She left looking quite upset. Thomas showed the message to Mrs. Sullivan, who actually laughed. Oh, I would have paid to see that conversation. The community knows who you are, James said quietly. Victoria's trying to paint you as an opportunist, but she's finding it rather difficult when everyone has a story about your kindness. Emma tugged at Thomas's sleeve. Does this mean we can call you Grandpa now? For real? The question hung in the air, weighted with hope and possibility. Thomas looked at the guardianship papers, then at the twins' anxious faces. He thought of Martha, of Claire's letter, of William's trust. You know, he said slowly, I always wanted grandchildren. Never thought I'd be lucky enough to get two at once. The twins' jubilant hugs nearly knocked him off his chair. Mrs. Sullivan dabbed at her eyes with her ever-present handkerchief, while James busied himself with his coffee, smiling. Victoria won't give up easily, the lawyer warned, once the twins had rushed off to share the news with their bears. No, Thomas agreed, but some things are worth fighting for. He signed the guardianship papers with a steady hand, each letter a promise to the family he'd found in the winter of his life. Outside, the morning sun broke through the storm clouds, casting long shadows across the lake where it had all begun. A week after the storm, Thomas stood at the lake's edge, watching the twins try out their new ice skates on the specially prepared rink. The town's maintenance crew had cleared and checked the ice thickness, creating a safe space far from where the accident had occurred. "Keep your ankles straight, Ethan," he called out, smiling as the boy wobbled but stayed upright. Emma glided past her brother, already finding her balance. "Just like swimming," she said confidently, "but backwards and sideways." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ice, but these shadows held no fear now. Other families had joined them, children's laughter echoing across the frozen surface. Local parents kept stopping by to shake Thomas's hand, sharing their own stories of his past kindnesses. "Remember when you helped Joey fix his bike?" Mrs. Thompson called from the bench where she was lacing up her daughter's skates. "He's in engineering school now. Says you inspired him." Thomas waved acknowledgement, his attention never fully leaving the twins. They'd been nervous about returning to the lake, but he'd suggested they face it together, turning fear into adventure. "The ice can't hurt you if you understand it," he'd explained that morning, showing them how to test thickness, teaching them the signs of danger. "Knowledge beats fear every time." Mrs. Sullivan appeared beside him, carrying a thermos of hot chocolate. She'd swapped her usual formal attire for a warm winter coat, though somehow she still managed to look elegant. "The children at school have started calling them the Anderson twins," she remarked, pouring cups for the skaters who were taking a break. "They seem quite proud of it." "Their father won't mind? William?" She smiled. "He called this morning. Said it's the first time they've been excited about school all year. Apparently, they gave a presentation about ice safety to their class. Used your handmade flashlights as visual aids." Thomas watched as Emma helped Ethan up after a small tumble, both of them giggling. Their cheeks were rosy with cold and joy, so different from the pale, frightened faces he remembered from that first day. "They're healing," Mrs. Sullivan said softly. "All of you are." She was right. Each day brought new progress. Small victories over the past's shadows. The twins had started talking about their mother more freely, sharing happy memories instead of just grief. Thomas found himself looking forward to mornings again, to teaching and learning and building new traditions. Victoria called the school. "Bored," Mrs. Sullivan continued, her tone careful. "Tried to suggest you weren't a suitable guardian." Thomas nodded, unsurprised. "And?" "The superintendent's wife was one of your regular customers at the hardware store. Said something about 20 years of honest business being worth more than any society connections." A cheer went up from the ice. Ethan had completed his first full lap without falling, his sister skating backward in front of him, encouraging each step. "Grandpa, look!" he called out. "I did it!" The word "Grandpa" still sent a warm shock through Thomas's heart. He raised his thermos in celebration, remembering another winter day, another pair of twins on ice. But this time, the story had a different ending. "Want to try, Mr. Anderson?" Emma skated to the edge, holding out her hand. "We can teach you." He hesitated. His arthritis had been acting up in the cold. "Go on," Mrs. Sullivan nudged him. "I've got your arthritis medication right here, and the children's skates came with a matching pair in your size." Almost as if someone planned this moment, Thomas looked at her suspiciously. "You and Claire, you were friends for a long time, weren't you? Long enough to learn that sometimes the best gifts are the ones that help us face our fears." She pressed a pair of skates into his hands. "Besides, William will want to hear all about this when he returns tomorrow." The twins waited expectantly, their faces glowing with hope and trust. Thomas sat on the nearby bench, beginning to lace up the skates. "Well," he said, "I suppose it's never too late to learn something new." As he stepped onto the ice, supported by small, strong hands on either side, Thomas realized that some circles needed to be completed before new patterns could begin. Here, where loss had led to love, winter's chill was giving way to spring's promise. William Harrison's private jet landed at dawn. Thomas knew this because the twins had been up since 4, watching the flight tracker on their tablets, providing minute-by-minute updates. Now they all stood in the mansion's entrance hall, the children barely containing their excitement. 3 minutes away, Emma announced, clutching her bear. 2 minutes and 40 seconds, Ethan corrected, equally anxious. Thomas straightened his tie, a new one Mrs. Sullivan had insisted on, and felt in his pocket for William's old business card, worn soft with age. He'd found it in the toolbox, filed away 20 years ago. William Harrison, summer assistant, printed in simple text. The sound of tires on gravel brought everyone to attention. Mrs. Sullivan made one final adjustment to Thomas's collar, then stepped back, her eyes suspiciously bright. William Harrison entered like a gentle storm, tall, purposeful, but with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners just like his mother's had. The twins launched themselves at him with twin cries of, "Daddy!" He caught them both, spinning once before setting them down. "I hear," he said, still holding their hands, "that you've been having quite the adventure while I was away." "We learned about ice safety," Ethan burst out. "And how to make flashlights," Emma added. "And Grandpa Thomas taught us about different kinds of wood. And we built a birdhouse, and we went skating." William held up a hand, laughing. "Slow down. Let me at least say hello to everyone." His gaze found Thomas, and for a moment 2 decades seemed to fall away. "Mr. Anderson." "William." Thomas smiled. "Still asking all the questions, I see." "Only way to learn." William stepped forward, hand extended, but instead of shaking hands, he pulled Thomas into a firm hug. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything, then and now." When they separated, both men's eyes were damp. William pulled out his own well-worn business card, one from the hardware store, Thomas Anderson, owner, printed in fading ink. "You know," William said, "I used most of what you taught me about tools to build my first computer prototype. The principles were the same. Understand the basics, respect the materials, build things to last." The twins watched this exchange with fascination. "Daddy," Emma said suddenly, "is that why you always say measure twice, cut once?" Both men laughed. "Your father," Thomas told her, "once tried to cut a length of premium oak without measuring at all. Cost him his first week's wages." "Best lesson I ever learned," William agreed. "Speaking of lessons..." He opened his briefcase, removing several formal-looking documents. "These need your signature, Mr. Anderson. Full legal adoption papers, making you officially the children's grandfather, if you're willing." Thomas felt his breath catch. "William, Please," William held up a hand. "Before you say anything, you should know. I found Mom's letter." Mrs. Sullivan made a small sound of surprise. "She left it in my old toolbox," William continued. "Said she'd been watching over you all these years, hoping I'd figure it out on my own, that some debts can never be repaid. With money alone." He looked at his children, who had pressed close to Thomas's sides. "When Claire died, I threw myself into work, thought I could fix grief with success, like a broken circuit. But what the twins needed, what I needed, was someone who understood that some things can't be fixed, only lived through with grace." Thomas remembered the long days after Martha's death, the quiet dignity of putting one foot in front of the other, of finding purpose in small kindnesses. "The adoption papers," William said softly, "they're just formalizing what's already true. You gave me more than a summer job back then. You showed me how to be the kind of man who builds things that matter." He held out an elegant fountain pen, a far cry from the pencil stubs Thomas used to keep behind his ear at the store. "So," William smiled, "ready to make it official?" Thomas looked at the twins' hopeful faces, at Mrs. Sullivan's proud smile, at the son his heart had claimed long before papers could prove it. "On one condition," he said gravely. "You let me teach you both how to properly sand a birdhouse. These grandchildren of mine deserve better than that crooked thing in the garden." The twins cheered. William laughed, the sound free and joyous. "Deal. Though in my defense, I was focusing more on coding than carpentry back then." As Thomas signed the papers, each stroke felt like building something new, a bridge between past and future, between loss and love, between the man who had helped a struggling family and the family now helping him find his way home. Victoria's response to the adoption was swift and fierce. She arrived at the mansion unannounced during the twins' morning lessons, brandishing court documents and trailed by two stern-faced lawyers. "This is a mockery," she declared, throwing the papers onto William's desk. "The board won't stand for it. A hardware store owner having access to the Harrison fortune? The press will have a field day." William, who had been reviewing quarterly reports, calmly removed his reading glasses. On his finger glinted the Harrison family ring, a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandfather, now worn as a reminder of humble beginnings. "The board," he said quietly, "has already approved my decision unanimously." "Impossible! I spoke with the 3 members you thought you could influence." William stood. "While you were busy plotting, I was showing them security footage of the rescue, sharing Thomas's background, explaining how he helped our family when we had nothing." Outside the office, Thomas sat with the twins in the library, trying to distract them with a lesson in simple electronics, but their eyes kept straying to the closed door. "Why is Aunt Victoria so angry?" Ethan whispered. "Sometimes," Thomas replied carefully, "people forget what really matters. They get so focused on what things are worth that they forget to ask what things are valuable." Emma's face scrunched in thought. "Like how Daddy says his old toolbox is worth more than his fancy cars?" Exactly like that. The office door burst open. Victoria stormed out, then stopped short at the sight of them. "You!" she pointed at Thomas. "You think you've won. Wait until the custody hearing. Wait until every detail of your life is examined. Every debt, every failure, every—" "That's enough." William's voice cut through her tirade. "You want a legal battle, Victoria? Fine. Let's have one. Let's discuss your attempts to manipulate the board, your harassment of Thomas's former neighbors, your calls to the school board." Victoria paled slightly. Behind her, James Chen appeared with another set of documents. "The hearing is tomorrow," he announced. "As requested, we've subpoenaed quite an interesting collection of witnesses." The next morning found them all at the county courthouse. Thomas wore his best suit, one of his own, not the expensive new ones, and sat between the twins, who had insisted on bringing their bears for moral support. One by one, the witnesses spoke. Grace, his former neighbor, described years of quiet generosity. The Thompson family detailed how he'd kept their credit at the hardware store during hard times. Former employees shared stories of fair treatment and life lessons learned. Then came the surprise witnesses. 3 board members from Harrison Technologies stood to testify about William's early years, about the values that had built their company's success. "Mr. Harrison always said he learned his business ethics from his first job," the chairwoman stated. "Now we understand why our company culture emphasizes building things to last." Victoria's face grew stonier with each testimony, but the final witness was the one who ended her challenge completely. Bradley, her own son, took the stand. Looking directly at his mother, he spoke about afternoons spent at Thomas's house while the twins were at their lessons. "He taught me how to fix things," Bradley said. "Not just with tools, but with patience, with respect. Mom, please, you're breaking something that doesn't need fixing." The judge's decision was swift and unequivocal. Thomas's adoption of the twins as their legal grandfather was upheld, with a stern rebuke to Victoria for wasting the court's time. In the courthouse corridor, Victoria approached Thomas one last time. But before she could speak, he held up a hand. "Join us for Sunday." "Dinner," he said simply. "Bring Bradley. I'm teaching the kids how to make Martha's apple pie. There's always room for more family at the table." Her carefully constructed anger crumbled. For a moment, she looked very young and very lost. "I just wanted," she began. "To protect them," Thomas finished. "I understand, but sometimes protection looks like letting people build something new." William, watching nearby, stepped forward to embrace his sister for the first time in years. The twins, sensing the shift in mood, pressed close to Thomas's sides. "Does this mean Aunt Victoria can help with the birdhouse too?" Ethan asked hopefully. Thomas smiled, feeling the weight of the family ring William had pressed into his hand that morning. "I think," he said, "we're all going to build something wonderful together." Spring came early that year, bringing with it new beginnings. Thomas stood in his newly completed workshop, built in what had once been an unused conservatory. Sunlight streamed through the glass ceiling, illuminating workbenches where three projects sat in various stages of completion. The door chimed as it opened. William's innovation, a gentle bell that sounded like the one from Thomas's old store. Emma burst in, waving a sheet of paper triumphantly. "Grandpa, look!" She thrust her report card forward. "All as in science, and Ms. Chen said my presentation on simple machines was the best in class." Thomas took the report card, noting the special commendation written in the margin. Emma's practical demonstrations, clearly influenced by her grandfather's teaching, brought the concepts to life for the entire class. "This calls for a celebration," he said, reaching for the key to his private cabinet. Inside sat his most precious possession, a key to the mansion's family wing, mounted on a handcrafted wooden plaque the twins had made him. "Ice cream before dinner?" Emma's eyes sparkled hopefully. "Even better. How about we start on that treehouse you and your brother have been designing?" Ethan appeared as if summoned by the word treehouse, Bradley trailing behind him carrying their shared notebook of drawings. "Really?" both boys asked simultaneously. "Your father approved the plans?" "This morning." Thomas spread their sketches across his workbench, said something about structural engineering running in the family now. Bradley, who had been spending more weekends at the mansion, studied the drawings with newfound confidence. "The support. Beams need reinforcement here," he pointed, "like you showed me with the birdhouse." The lesson that followed was interrupted by Mrs. Sullivan, bringing lemonade and news that Victoria would be joining them for dinner, her third visit that month. The changes in her had been subtle but significant, starting with her quiet request to learn basic home repairs just in case the twins need help when you're busy. William found them all there later, covered in sawdust and deep in debate about pulley systems for the treehouse basket lift. He leaned against the doorframe, watching his sister's son work alongside his children, all of them hanging on Thomas's every word. "The board approved the new initiative," he announced. "The Thomas Anderson Technical Education Center will open at Harrison Technologies next fall. Full scholarships for students who want to learn trades alongside coding." Thomas looked up from the blueprints, startled. "William, I never meant to inspire a whole new generation." "Too late?" William grinned. "The applications are already pouring in. Turns out a lot of kids want to learn how to build things that last." The dinner that evening was a casual affair by mansion standards, pizza eaten in Thomas's workshop while reviewing treehouse plans. Victoria arrived with a housewarming gift for the new space, a vintage level she'd found at an antique shop. "The owner said it came from your old store," she explained somewhat shyly. "I thought, well, everything needs proper alignment to stand straight." Thomas recognized the tool. He'd sold it 30 years ago to a young couple starting their first home renovation. The fact that Victoria had tracked it down spoke volumes about her changing priorities. Later, after the kids had been sent to bed, still chattering about treehouse features, Thomas sat in his favorite chair by the library fire. The family wing key caught the firelight, its plaque bearing the simple inscription, "Home is where we build together." Mrs. Sullivan appeared with his evening tea. "Claire would have loved all this," she said softly. "She always said the mansion needed more sawdust and fewer formalities." "She planned well," Thomas observed. "You both did. We just laid the foundation. You all built something beautiful on it." She straightened a picture on the wall, the twins' latest family portrait, now including Bradley, Victoria, and a very contented-looking orange cat. "Though I must say, I never expected Oscar to adapt quite so thoroughly to luxury." Thomas chuckled. "He's like his owner that way, though I still keep some of the cheap cat food just to stay grounded." Speaking of staying grounded, Mrs. Sullivan's eyes twinkled. "The twins may have mentioned that the treehouse plans include a special grandfather's reading nook with a proper tool storage area." Thomas nodded. And a weather station, and possibly a small telescope. Building things to last, she quoted softly. No, Thomas corrected, touching the family key. Building things to grow. Summer arrived with the scent of fresh-cut grass and new beginnings. The mansion buzzed with preparation for a double celebration, the twins' 9th birthday and the 1-year anniversary of what they now called the Lake Day. Mrs. Sullivan had outdone herself with the planning, though she insisted the best ideas came from a certain photo album she discovered in the library. The album, leather-bound and pristine, began with newspaper clippings about the rescue and continued through the year's transformations. Each page told a story. Thomas teaching the twins basic repairs, Bradley's first successful woodworking project, Victoria learning to use power tools with only minor incidents, William working alongside them all in the new workshop. It's a proper family history now, Mrs. Sullivan said, adding recent photos of the completed treehouse, a structure that had somehow grown to include a weather station, reading nook, and surprisingly sophisticated pulley system. The celebration spread across the mansion's grounds, mixing formal elegance with homey touches that were purely Thomas's influence. Tables of fine china sat alongside workbenches where children could build simple birdhouses. The twins' school. Friends darted between activities, many accompanied by parents who'd known Thomas from his hardware store days. Remember when you helped us pick our first toolkit? Mr. Thompson reminisced, watching his daughter learn about different wood types. Who knew our kids would be learning the same lessons from you here? The twins held court from their treehouse, proudly giving tours and demonstrating the basket lift they'd engineered with their grandfather's guidance. Bradley, now a regular weekend resident, operated the pulley system with professional flair. Mum helped with the safety features, he told visitors, making Victoria beam with unexpected pride. William had arranged for a special surprise. Graduates from the first Thomas Anderson Technical Education Center program demonstrated their projects, seamlessly blending traditional craftsmanship with modern technology. One young woman showed off a robot she'd built using woodworking techniques learned from Thomas himself. The old ways and the new, William explained to the gathered crowd. Just like Dad taught me, understand the foundations before you build the future. The moment he said it, William blinked in surprise at his own words. Thomas, standing nearby, felt his heart swell. The casual dad had slipped out naturally, unplanned, but entirely true. Grace arrived with a group from the senior center, carrying containers of her famous cookies. Can't have a proper celebration without these, she announced. Thomas used to fix our appliances in exchange for baking lessons. Now look at him, teaching a whole new generation. As evening approached, the party moved to the lakeside. String. Lights twinkled in the trees, and tables groaned with a mix of gourmet catering and homemade comfort food. Miguel had outdone himself with a cake that somehow incorporated both traditional elegance and tiny fondant tools. The twins insisted Thomas join them at the head table, their bears occupying seats of honor. Emma's science project, a working model of simple machines, held pride of place next to Ethan's detailed treehouse blueprints. Speech, someone called out, and suddenly all eyes turned to Thomas. He stood slowly, touching the family ring that now felt natural on his finger. "A year ago," he began, "I took a walk by this lake, thinking my best days were behind me. I was wrong. Life, it turns out, doesn't measure time in years, but in moments of love." He looked at his expanded family, the twins, William, Victoria, and Bradley, Mrs. Sullivan, and even Oscar the cat lounging regally nearby. "Someone very wise once told me that the best things we build aren't made of wood or metal, but of trust and time and caring." Emma tugged at his sleeve. "Was that Grandma Martha?" "No, sweetheart. It was your mother." He smiled at William. Claire knew something about building families that last. As if on cue, a soft breeze rippled across the lake, carrying the scent of summer flowers. The photo album lay open on a nearby table, its pages telling the story of how love could build bridges across any distance, even between this world and the next. Victoria raised her glass. "To family," she said simply. "To building things that last," William added. "To Grandpa," the twins chorused, and everyone laughed. Thomas looked out over the gathering, past friends and new family, all brought together by a moment of courage that had turned out to be just the foundation of something far more magnificent. "To love," he said quietly, "the strongest building material of all." On the morning of the rescue's one-year anniversary, Thomas woke early to find two small packages outside his door. Inside each was a golden locket, expertly crafted to match. One contained a photo of Martha, the other of Claire, the past and present guardians of this unexpected family. The children picked them out, Mrs. Sullivan explained over morning coffee. "Said every good family needs its guardian angels properly honored." Thomas fastened both around his neck, tucked safely under his collar. Their weight felt right, like anchors connecting different chapters of his life. In the kitchen, the twins were already up, supervising Miguel's preparation of Martha's apple pie recipe, now a mandatory part of all family celebrations. Their bears watched from a safe distance, sporting tiny tool belts the children had insisted on making in the workshop. "Grandpa," Emma called out, "is it true that you're going to teach at the technical center?" Thomas nodded. "Just one class. Foundations of craftsmanship. Your father thinks the students should learn from someone who remembers when tools had no batteries." "Can we come watch sometimes?" Ethan asked, carefully measuring cinnamon, just as Martha had taught Thomas decades ago. "I think that could be arranged." William's voice came from the doorway. He'd started working from home 3 days a week, his corporate suits increasingly replaced by workshop-appropriate attire. After all, the next generation of Harrison builders needs proper training. The twins beamed at this. Ever since the treehouse project, they'd shown increasing interest in both the practical and technical sides of creation. Emma's room now housed a growing collection of engineering books, while Ethan had started sketching designs for increasingly ambitious projects. Victoria arrived mid-morning with Bradley carrying a mysterious package. "Found these in Mother's attic," she explained, unveiling a set of antique woodworking tools. "Apparently our grandfather was quite the craftsman before he went into banking." "The Harrison building gene," William mused. "Seems it runs deeper than we knew." They spent the morning in the workshop, Thomas teaching them all how to restore the old tools to their former glory. Victoria, no longer afraid to get her hands dirty, worked alongside everyone else, her perfectionism finding a new outlet in the precise art of restoration. Bradley, who had recently announced his intention to study architectural engineering, took detailed notes on each technique. "For my college application essay," he explained, "about how sometimes you have to break down walls to build better ones." At lunchtime, Grace arrived with a group of seniors from her meal delivery program. The mansion's dining room had become a regular gathering place for community meals, breaking down barriers between wealth and want just as surely as Thomas's. Presence had bridged the family's past and present. "You've built something remarkable here," Grace told Thomas as they watched the mixed group share stories and food. "Not just a family, but a community." "We all did," he corrected her. "One nail, one meal, one kind word at a time." The afternoon found them all at the lake, where the twins had organized a skating demonstration for the younger children from their class. Thomas watched from his favorite bench, the two lockets warm against his chest. "They're watching, you know," Mrs. Sullivan said softly, joining him. "Claire and Martha. I like to think they arranged all this together." "Wouldn't put it past them," Thomas agreed. "Martha always said she'd find a way to make sure I didn't spend my golden years alone with my toolbox." A commotion arose from the lake as Ethan successfully performed his first backward skate. Emma cheering him on. William caught the moment on video while Victoria shouted encouraging tips about balance and form. Later, as the sun set over the water, the family gathered in the library. The twins had insisted on a new tradition, reading from Thomas's old project notebooks, each page filled with sketches and measurements from decades of building and repairing. "Tell us about this one, Grandpa." Emma pointed to a detailed drawing of a dollhouse. "That was for your father's sister," Thomas revealed. "The Christmas their family was just getting back on their feet." Victoria looked up sharply. "The Victorian style. And with the tiny working doors. I still have that in my study." "Built to last," Thomas said simply. As night fell, the library filled with the soft sounds of family. Bradley explaining physics to the twins, Victoria and William discussing the technical centre's expansion, Mrs. Sullivan quietly refilling teacups. Thomas touched the lockets again, feeling the circle of love that had brought him here complete itself. Some things, he realized, were built to do more than last. They were built to grow, to change, to embrace new additions while honoring old foundations, just like family, just like home. As winter approached again, Thomas stood in the mansion's grand hall, adjusting a newly hung family tree. Unlike the formal portraits of Harrison ancestors that had once dominated the space, this one was crafted from wood and metal in the workshop, each name engraved by hand. The twins had helped design it, insisting on branches that could grow and expand, Martha's name intertwined with his at the roots. Claire's spirit flowed through the trunk, connecting past to present. The newest branches held the current family. William, the twins, Victoria and Bradley, even Mrs. Sullivan and Oscar, each name carved with care and purpose. "It's perfect," William said, coming to stand beside him. "A blueprint of love." "The best kind of building plan," Thomas agreed, touching the lockets that hadn't left his neck since the anniversary. The mansion had changed over the past year, warming from a showpiece into a true home. The formal sitting room now housed the twins' science projects alongside antique vases. The workshop's sawdust occasionally tracked through marble halls, and no one minded. "Did you see the applications?" "For next year's technical center program," William asked. "Double last year's numbers. Your stories inspired quite a few people." "Our story," Thomas corrected, "built by all of us." The twins burst in from outside, cheeks red from the cold. "Grandpa, the first snow is coming," Emma announced. "Can we check the weather station?" "And reinforce the treehouse for winter," Ethan added hopefully. "After your homework," William reminded them, but his eyes twinkled. "Though I suppose calculating wind resistance counts as physics." Victoria arrived for her regular Sunday visit, carrying blueprints for the technical center's expansion. "The board approved the community workshop space," she announced. "Free access to tools and training for anyone who needs it. Just like your old store's lending program," Bradley added, looking up from his college applications. Thomas smiled. Remembering countless tools loaned out over the years, many returned with plates of cookies or handshake promises kept. Mrs. Sullivan appeared with hot chocolate for everyone, a blend of Miguel's gourmet chocolate and the simple mix Thomas still preferred. Like everything in their new life, it was a perfect balance of old and new, simple and refined. "The contractor called," she told William. "The renovations for the elder care center are ahead of schedule." This was Thomas's pet project, converting part of the mansion's grounds into a place where seniors could age with dignity, sharing their skills and stories with younger generations. Grace had already signed up to run the cooking programs. As evening settled over the lake, the family gathered in the library. The twins curled up with their bears, now quite worn from adventures. Bradley sketched building designs while Victoria offered suggestions. William worked on his laptop. Though he kept getting distracted by his children's chatter, Thomas sat in his favorite chair, watching them all. He thought of that cold morning by the lake, of frozen water and warm hearts, of how a single moment of courage could build foundations for generations to come. "Grandpa," Emma said suddenly, "tell us again about the day you jumped in the lake." "You know that story, sweetheart." "But it's our favorite," Ethan insisted, "because it's when our family really began." Thomas looked at the family tree hanging in the hall, its branches strong and growing. He touched the lockets, feeling Martha and Claire's presence in every moment of joy their family shared. "Well," he began, "it was a cold winter morning, and I was taking my usual walk. Outside, the first snow began to fall, each flake a tiny miracle of design and purpose. Inside, surrounded by the family he'd built through love and trust, Thomas Anderson told the story of how he learned that life's greatest adventures don't end with age. Sometimes they're just beginning. And on his finger, the Harrison family. Ring caught the firelight, its simple circle reflecting the eternal truth that the strongest things we build are not made of wood or metal or money, but of love, courage, and the willingness to dive deep into life's frozen waters, trusting that warmth and family wait on the other side.